The Battle of the Backyard. The morning sun spilled over the quiet cul-de-sac of Maple Grove, a suburban haven where neatly trimmed lawns and polite waves defined the rhythm of life. I was halfway through my coffee, savoring the stillness of a Saturday, when I heard her voice cutting through the air like a siren. Diane, my neighbor, was already in my front yard before I could even open the door. She stood there, clutching a clipboard like it was a scepter, her floral scarf fluttering in the breeze. The sight of her alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. Diane had a reputation in our homeowners association, HOA, for turning minor issues into neighborhood crusades. Last year, she'd fined me for my mailbox being too reflective. The year before, she'd complained my dog's leash was excessively colorful. Today, though, she was all smiles, her voice dripping with honey as she launched into her pitch. "Mark, I have a tiny favor to ask," she said, not waiting for me to respond. "My niece, Emily, is getting married, and we need a small space for a quick, quiet ceremony. Your backyard, with that gorgeous maple tree, would be perfect. It'll be barely noticeable, I promise. 30 minutes, tops." I stared at her, my coffee cooling in my hand. Diane's promises were about as reliable as a weather forecast in a tornado. I remembered her small book club meeting that turned into a 3-hour karaoke marathon, complete with a fog machine she swore was just for ambience. Still, I played along, keeping my face neutral. 30 minutes? I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Absolutely," she chirped, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who'd already decided I'd say yes. No fuss, no mess. Just a sweet little moment for Emily. She waved her hand as if the whole thing would vanish like a puff of smoke. I sipped my coffee, letting her words hang in the air. Diane didn't know it, but she'd just lit the fuse on a plan that had been simmering in my mind for years. Her HOA citations, her endless nitpicking, her assumption that my property was her playground, it all came rushing back. I'd been patient, but patience has a limit, and Diane had just found mine. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my tone even. That was enough to make her beam like she'd won a raffle. She practically skipped back to her house, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender perfume and a trail of assumptions. I closed the door, leaned against it, and grinned. The gears were already turning. That evening, I walked my backyard, notepad in hand, plotting like a general before a battle. My lawn, my pride and joy, was a canvas of green, framed by flower beds I'd spent years perfecting. The maple tree Diane coveted stood tall, its branches casting long shadows. 30 minutes, she'd said. I knew better. Diane's version of quick involved caterers, speakers, and enough decorations to rival a county fair. I'd seen her turn a baby shower into a spectacle with a balloon arch taller than her garage. I marked the sprinkler lines, checked the mower's reach, and tested the leaf blower's roar. Diane's 30 minutes would stretch into hours, and when they did, I'd be ready. I called my neighbor, Jim, a retired mechanic with a grudge against Diane ever since she'd had his rose bushes trimmed into cubes for aesthetic uniformity. He answered on the first ring. "Jim, you still got that industrial leaf blower?" I asked. He chuckled, low and gruff. "What's Diane done now?" I told him the story, and by the end, he was all in. We made a pact. I'd mow, he'd blow, and if Diane's wedding ran a second over her promised window, we'd unleash a symphony of yard work that would make her regret setting foot on my grass. We roped in Susan, a sharp-witted widow from 3 houses down, to film the whole thing from her upstairs window. By nightfall, we had a group chat buzzing with plans, a schedule, and a shared sense of justice. The next morning, Diane was back, her clipboard now covered in sketches. She'd drawn out where the chairs would go, where the bride would stand, even where the photographer would capture the golden hour glow. She mentioned a violinist, then backtracked to say it might be a small band, but they play softly, she assured me, as if that made it fine. I asked how many guests she expected. She glanced at her papers, then at me. "Oh, not many. Maybe 50. 60 tops. 80 if the cousins show up. 80 people. On my lawn. With tables, cables, and who knew what else." I nodded, my face a mask, and told her she could proceed on one condition. "Start and finish in 30 minutes, I said. She didn't even blink. "Of course," she replied, as if she were doing me a favor. As she strutted away, I opened my garage and pulled out the mower. It hadn't been used in a week, but it roared to life on the first pull, like it knew what was coming. Jim wandered over, his eyes glinting with mischief. "You look like you're about to start a revolution," he said. I grinned and told him it was more like a reclamation. Over the next 2 days, Diane's preparations escalated. Trucks rolled into the cul-de-sac, unloading chairs, tables, and a portable arch that landed right between my azaleas and the maple tree, ignoring the no-step signs I'd posted after receding. Round tables sprouted up, each with centerpieces of candles and monogrammed coasters. I counted 100 chairs before I stopped out of sheer spite. They parked across my driveway. They taped cords along my porch. They left coffee cups in my flower beds. I said nothing. I watered my garden, waved at Diane's sister as she rehearsed her entrance in heels that sank into my grass, and waited. The night before the wedding, Diane stopped by to confirm. She chirped about how grateful she was, how perfect it would be. I told her I was thrilled to help. She left, oblivious to the mower gassed up and ready in my garage. Then I saw her flyer online. She'd advertised my backyard as an exclusive private garden venue with panoramic beauty. My name wasn't mentioned once. That was it. The final straw. Tomorrow, under my maple tree, Diane would meet the consequences of her own making. The day before the wedding, chaos descended on Maple Grove like a flock of overzealous pigeons. At 7 in the morning, a truck rumbled up my street, its brakes squealing as it parked in front of my driveway. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the driver hop out and start unloading folding chairs. 10, 20, 30, I lost count at 60, but they kept coming, stacking up like they were prepping for a town hall meeting. Diane's small wedding was already looking like a circus. By 9, a second truck arrived, this one carrying long metal poles and rolls of white fabric. I watched, jaw tight, as workers began erecting a full-sized tent over my prized lawn. This wasn't some flimsy canopy. It was the kind you'd see at a charity gala, complete with string lights and stakes driven deep into my flower beds. I'd just replanted those beds last week, and every thud of the hammer felt like a personal insult. At noon, a third vehicle pulled up a smaller van, but its cargo was the final blow. A bright blue portable toilet, plopped at the edge of my backyard like a neon sign screaming betrayal. My sprinkler lines ran right under that spot. If someone flushed at the wrong time, my irrigation system would be a hazmat zone. I gripped my coffee mug so hard I thought it might crack. Diane appeared around one, carrying a tray of sandwiches like she was hosting a picnic. "Mark, you're a saint for this," she said, offering me one with a smile that might have worked if I hadn't just seen her crew knock over my bird bath. I mentioned the tent, the toilet, and the sheer number of chairs. She laughed, a tinkling sound that set my teeth on edge. "Oh, we just need a little flexibility," she said. "It's still quick. 30 minutes, like I promised." I pointed to the speakers being set up near the maple tree. "What are those for, then?" She blinked, then mumbled something about soft background music. Moments later, a man tested a microphone at full blast, the words "check, check" echoing down the block like a rock concert soundcheck. I nodded, said nothing, and went back inside. My blood pressure was climbing, but I had a plan, and it was keeping me steady. By late afternoon, my yard looked like a wedding planner's fever dream. Rows of chairs stretched past my herb garden. A bar table stood by the fence, next to a cooler the size of a small boat. One of Emily's groomsmen tried plugging a soundboard into my outdoor outlet without asking. When I unplugged it, he stared at me like I'd just kicked his puppy. Diane waved from across the lawn, yelling, "It's all coming together." I waved back, then turned to my shed, where the mower and leaf blower waited like loyal allies. Jim stopped by that evening, shaking his head as he surveyed the scene. A violinist was unloading her case from a van, and Jim muttered, "This is the most peaceful invasion I've ever seen." I told him we were sticking to the plan. If Diane's wedding ran past 30 minutes, we'd start our ceremony, one dedicated to the glory of yard maintenance. He laughed, a sound that carried years of pent-up frustration with Diane's antics. The next morning, a fourth truck arrived with a massive wooden archway, draped in silken flowers. Workers carried it to the maple tree, ignoring the fragile roots I'd spent years protecting. They hammered the base into the dirt, stomping over the soil like it was a construction site. Diane directed them with the precision of a film director, giving me a thumbs up when she caught my eye. I forced a smile, my knuckles white around my coffee mug. Cars started parking along the street, blocking driveways and crushing the new sprinkler head I'd installed last week. A kid chasing a balloon stepped on it, snapping it clean off. His mom laughed and asked if I had any bottled water. Fresh out, I said, my voice flat. She didn't catch the double meaning. I called the HOA president, Tom, that afternoon. He sounded like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Mark, it's just a one-time thing, he said, his voice shaky. Diane said it'll be fast and quiet. I reminded him of Diane's rooftop karaoke disaster 2 years ago, when she'd promised the same thing. I also pointed out the HOA rule: no more than 10 non-resident guests for backyard events without board approval. He sputtered about community spirit and temporary permissions. I told him to do what he needed to do and hung up. Susan texted me later, confirming her camera was ready with an extra battery pack. She'd set up tripods upstairs for the best angles, especially for when Diane tried to argue with the mower. Jim reported his leaf blower was tuned and ready to roar. I checked the sprinkler app on my phone, making sure I could activate it manually if needed. Everything was in place. As the sun set, my backyard glowed with fairy lights and chandeliers hanging from the tent poles. Monogrammed napkins sat on every table, and a fake marble gift table stood by the arch. I stood in the middle of it all, the so-called gracious host, surrounded by strangers. Someone's uncle was rehearsing a speech from a rom-com, his voice carrying over the hum of the setup. I checked the mower's gas, turned off the sprinkler timer to avoid any accidents, and whispered to myself, showtime's tomorrow. The morning of the wedding dawned with an eerie calm, the kind that settles in before a storm. The sun cast a golden glow over the tent, mocking the chaos to come. Birds chirped, bees buzzed, and in the distance, I heard the faint wail of an accordion. I hoped it wasn't part of the ceremony, but with Diane, anything was possible. I stood in my garage, hands on the mower's handle, its blades freshly sharpened. It had roared like a beast during last night's test run, hungry for action. Jim arrived at 7, leaf blower slung over his shoulder like a rifle, a bag of donuts in his other hand. He revved the blower once, the sound bouncing off the tent poles. "She's ready," he said, grinning. I grabbed a donut and pointed to the shed, where extension cords and power reels were coiled and waiting. We were prepared with military precision, not for revenge, but for justice for my lawn, my peace, my dignity. Around 9:30, Tom, the HOA president, shuffled over in khakis and sunglasses, looking like he'd rather be at a dentist appointment. "Just checking in," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. I handed him a lawn chair and said, "You'll want a front row seat." He laughed nervously and sat down, asking if I had popcorn. I didn't, but Susan arrived minutes later with a bag of caramel corn, passing it around like we were at a county fair. Other neighbors started showing up, some on dog walks, others on jogs that conveniently ended at my property line. Word had spread. Something big was coming. By 11, the transformation was complete. Caterers fussed over tablecloths. Bridesmaids shrieked about a lost hairpin. Someone dragged an ice chest across my mulch, leaving a trail of destruction. I watched from my kitchen window, sipping coffee, calm as a man with a spreadsheet and a cause. Diane floated around in a shimmering beige dress, smiling for photos and barking orders in the same breath. At 12:30, a man in a black vest arrived with a headset and clipboard, acting like he was directing a Hollywood blockbuster. He mounted a GoPro on a tent pole and rearranged my patio furniture for a camera dolly without asking. I stepped outside and reminded him this was private property. He blinked at me, confused, until Diane swooped in. "It's fine. Mark agreed to everything," she said, waving me off. 30 minutes, I said, my voice low. "Of course," she replied, already turning to fix Emily's veil with theatrical flair. Jim texted at 1:45, "Engine's ready." I sent a thumbs up. Susan sent a photo of the crowd gathering at her window, tripods and zoom lenses in place. Tom, the HOA president, borrowed a chair from my garage. I made a mental note to bill Diane for it later. At 1:55, the Bonda string quartet, not a violinist, started warming up, their soft notes drifting over the lawn. At 1:59, Diane took her place under the maple tree, gesturing for the guests to sit. The flower girl scattered petals like she was covering a crime scene. 3 o'clock hit like a lightning bolt. The music swelled, the officiant raised his arms, and I pulled the mower's cord. The engine roared to life, a glorious, guttural sound that drowned out the quartet. Jim followed, his leaf blower screaming like a jet engine. Grass clippings and petals flew into the air, a hurricane of green and pink. I pushed the mower toward the tent's edge, carving through their rented rug like it was butter. The roar of the mower was a battle cry, slicing through the delicate strains of the string quartet like a chainsaw through silk. Grass clippings and stray petals swirled into the air, a chaotic confetti that marked the end of Diane's carefully orchestrated fantasy. Jim swung his leaf blower in a wide arc, sending a spray of debris across the wedding aisle. The effect was immediate and glorious. Guests flinched, some gasped, others ducked as if under attack. The officiant, a man with eyebrows like twin caterpillars, tried to shout over the noise, but his dearly beloved was swallowed by the mower's growl. Diane spun around, her beige dress catching the light as her eyes locked on me. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear a word over the engines. I gave her a nod, the kind you'd give a neighbor asking for a cup of sugar, and kept mowing. Jim aimed his blower at a groomsman who'd taken a step forward, scattering the man's hair into a vertical wave. The poor guy froze, hands raised like he was surrendering to a tornado. The scene was pure chaos, and it was beautiful. The tent's white fabric rippled in the artificial wind, tablecloths flapped, and a tray of champagne glasses teetered on the edge of a table. Diane marched toward me, her heels sinking into the lawn with every furious step. I paused the mower, not out of mercy, but because I wanted to hear her. This was her moment, the climax of her self-inflicted drama, and I wasn't going to miss it. "Mark, what are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You're ruining my niece's wedding." I leaned on the mower's handle, calm as a summer breeze. "Clock says 3:04, Diane. You're past your 30 minutes. This is sabotage," she spat, pointing at the shredded rug and the arch now smeared with grass. "You're doing this out of spite." I held up my phone, the timer app ticking past 36 minutes. "You said 30 minutes. Not 3 hours, not a photo shoot, not 100 guests. 30 minutes. She scoffed, her face a mix of desperation and disbelief. "It's a minor delay. A misunderstanding." I didn't argue. I just pulled the mower's cord again, and the engine roared back to life. Diane's voice vanished, drowned out by the sound of justice. I drove the blades through a row of rose petals, their delicate pink petals scattering like confetti in a blender. Jim kept blowing, his face lit with the kind of joy you only get from long overdue payback. The chaos bloomed. A camera stand toppled, its lens crunching into the grass. The cake table shifted, wobbling dangerously. Someone dropped a tray of glasses, the crash barely audible over the blower's scream. Diane stood in the center of it all, arms outstretched, spinning like she could stop the storm with sheer willpower. But this storm was us, and we were just warming up. The string quartet gave up, their instruments clutched like shields as they ducked behind a row of chairs. A bridesmaid's curls twisted into a knot, and another groomsman looked like he'd been hit by a leaf-filled fire hose. Guests sat frozen, their programs flapping in the wind, some trying to pretend this was all part of the charm. An older woman in a wide hat whispered to her neighbor about rustic authenticity. A teenager with a phone muttered, "This is going viral." Diane made her next move, storming toward Tom, the HOA president, who sat in his borrowed chair, munching caramel corn like he was at a matinee. She jabbed a finger at him, shouting about bylaws and neighborly decency, as if she'd ever cared about either. Tom shrugged, his mouth full, and pointed vaguely at me. Diane spun away, her heels stabbing the lawn, and charged back in my direction. I paused the mower again, ready for round 2. She was a portrait of fury, her dress streaked with grass stains, her voice hoarse. "You're a menace, Mark. You've ruined the most important day of Emily's life." I tilted my head, unfazed. "You promised 30 minutes, Diane. I warned you. 6 times. She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. I hit the sprinkler app on my phone, and the system burst to life. Water shot upward in crisp arcs, soaking tablecloths, dresses, and the carefully printed menus. Guests yelped, scrambling to escape. The DJ, who'd been hovering near the tent with his laptop, took one look at the geysers and bolted, his equipment tucked under his arm like a football. The sprinklers were an impulse, a cherry on top of the chaos sundae. I hadn't planned to use them so soon, but the timing felt right. Diane stood frozen, drenched, clutching a bouquet that now looked like a soggy mop. The officiant tried to restart, shouting, "Dearly beloved," again, but the water drowned him out. Guests started fleeing, first a few in high heels, tiptoeing through the mud, then an aunt who'd come for the cake, using a cushion as an umbrella. Kids screamed, caterers abandoned their trays, and the groomsmen with the wind-blown hair sat down in the grass, staring into the void. Diane made one last stand. She called out to the crowd, her voice cracking. "We'll resume shortly. Love conquers all." But it was over. Emily, the bride, walked up to her, whispered something, then said it louder. "We're going to the backup venue." Diane's face fell. Backup what? Emily had reserved a space at the local country club, Lake View, air conditioning, and no lawnmowers. The exodus began. Guests grabbed their gift bags and ran. Cars peeled out, tires squealing. Someone left a single high heel sinking into the mud like a monument to defeat. Within 15 minutes, my yard was empty except for me, Jim, Tom, and Diane. She stood under the maple tree, mascara trailing down her face, looking like a watercolor left in the rain. She glared at me as if I were the villain. I met her gaze, a man who'd warned her and been ignored. Tom stood, cleared his throat, and said he'd be filing a report about the event violating HOA guidelines. Diane shrieked that it was his fault, that he'd approved it, that we were all against her. I started the mower one last time, making a final pass through the trampled grass, now a mushy mix of mud and petals. Diane left without another word, barefoot, heels in one hand, bouquet in the other, dragging her entitlement behind her like a broken dream. Jim and I stood in silence as the sun dipped below the trees. The wind rustled the tent, which would be gone by morning. I turned off the sprinklers, powered down the mower, and sat on the porch. Jim handed me the last donut. Susan texted a still of Diane mid-scream, perfectly framed by a sprinkler's burst. I saved it. That night, I walked the yard, assessing the damage. Torn grass, crushed flower beds, toppled lights. It was bad, but it was mine. Diane had learned that not every backyard was hers for the taking. Some lines, once crossed, came with consequences. The next morning, the internet did what it does best. Susan's video, leaked by a teenage guest, was everywhere. Titled "Bridezilla Meets Mower Mayhem." It showed Diane's slow-motion meltdown as the sprinklers erupted and Jim swung his blower like a warrior. By the time I finished my coffee, it had 70,000 views and climbing. Someone had set it to dramatic music, zooming in on Diane's shocked face. The comments were a mix of jokes, cheers, and debates about whether I'd gone too far. Diane vanished, at least for the day. Her decorations were cleared by a quiet cleanup crew who avoided my gaze. The only evidence left was a monogrammed napkin stuck under my car tire. Around noon, a local news van rolled in, chasing a quirky human interest story. They knocked on Diane's door, but she didn't answer. Susan gave a dramatic retelling, Jim snuck his blower into every shot, and Tom offered a vague statement about respecting property. I just waved from the porch. By afternoon, the video hit the national news. Memes exploded. Diane's face on a storm cloud, me with the mower like a superhero. Someone started selling shirts with 30 minutes means 30 and a cartoon lawnmower. I didn't buy one, but I was tempted. Diane reemerged that evening, her hair in a tight bun, her expression icy. She pinned a notice to the community board, a typed letter accusing me of noise terrorism and vowing legal action. The response was swift. A neighbor posted it online with "Diane doubles down" as the caption. Another turned it into a Shakespearean monologue. The more she fought, the bigger it grew. This wasn't just a failed wedding, Anna-Marie, it was a legend. The fallout from Diane's wedding disaster rippled through Maple Grove like a stone tossed into a still pond. By Monday morning, the neighborhood was buzzing not with the usual hum of lawnmowers or kids on bikes, but with whispers, knowing glances, and the occasional burst of laughter from someone scrolling through their phone. The video, now at 150,000 views, had become a local legend, shared across group chats and coffee clutches. My backyard, once just a quiet patch of green, was now the stage for a suburban saga that had everyone picking sides. I spent the morning cleaning up what was left of Diane's extravaganza. The cleanup crew had hauled away the tent and chairs, but the lawn bore scars, deep ruts from the tent stakes, crushed azaleas, and a soggy pile of napkins plastered to the grass. I raked, seeded, and watered, my hands steady, but my mind replaying the chaos of the day before. Every time I passed the maple tree, I couldn't help but smile. It had stood firm, a silent witness to Diane's downfall. Around 10, a man in a gray suit knocked on my door. He handed me a thick envelope and left without a word. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Diane's lawyer, claiming emotional distress, reputational harm, and demanding a public apology. She'd even attached the HOA guidelines as if they'd back her up. I read it twice, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and laughed. The guidelines listed every violation she'd committed: excessive guests, unauthorized structures, amplified sound. It was a checklist of her arrogance. I drafted a response, attaching photos of my ruined lawn, a repair estimate, and the text where Diane had promised a quick and quiet event. I ended with a polite, "Thank you for your time. Please direct further communication to my legal representative." I didn't have a lawyer, but it sounded good. I mailed it and never heard back. The HOA felt the heat next. Diane tried to spin the narrative, emailing the board about unsafe neighbors and hostile community members. It didn't land. Several residents had seen the video, and those who hadn't heard the story from Susan, who'd taken to retelling it with the flair of a campfire storyteller. The board called an informal meeting with me, asking if I'd present my side at the next official gathering. I agreed, already compiling a folder, photos of the damage, Diane's flyer calling my yard a luxury venue, and a thumb drive with the now infamous video. The meeting was a spectacle. I spoke calmly, laying out the timeline: Diane's promise, her overreach, my warnings, her disregard. I showed the photos, played the video, and read her text aloud. By the end, the room was nodding along. A retiree named Carl suggested a new rule: no HOA-related events on private property without notarized consent and a guest cap. It passed unanimously. Diane didn't show. Rumor was she'd gone to her sisters in the city to clear her head. I doubted it would help. Her face was now a sticker on someone's laptop, her scream a ringtone. The internet doesn't forget. That night, Jim and I sat on my porch, sipping lemonade and watching the sunset. The lawn was healing, new grass sprouting in the bare patches. The mower rested in the shed, a quiet hero. We didn't talk much as sat, letting the peace settle over us. Somewhere, a neighbor laughed, and the sound carried on the breeze. For the first time in days, Maple Grove felt like home again. But Diane wasn't done. A week later, flyers appeared across the neighborhood, taped to mailboxes, clipped to doors, fluttering on community boards. In swirling cursive, they announced a vow renewal ceremony, private and intimate, set for Sunday at 4 in the afternoon. The location? My backyard, under the maple tree. Again, the audacity was almost admirable, like a general marching back to a battlefield she'd already lost. I found one on my door and crumpled it, tossing it into the trash with a mix of amusement and irritation. Jim stopped by, holding his copy, his face torn between disbelief and delight. "She didn't learn a thing," he muttered, pointing to the fine print. "Fewer guests, no band, no tent, but still my yard." Diane had dressed it up as a heartfelt renewal, but I knew her tricks. There'd be chairs, fairy lights, maybe a battery-powered speaker she'd claim wasn't amplified. I spent Saturday watching her crew from my porch, coffee in hand. They measured the lawn, glancing at my property line like they were casing a bank. Every time they got too close, I let the screen door slam shut, the sound echoing like a warning shot. Diane didn't knock this time. She'd learned that much, but her silence wasn't humility. It was an assumption, the kind that left trash in my flower beds and called it eco-friendly. That night, I checked the sprinkler system, running a test spray near the maple tree. I replaced 2 faulty heads and cranked the water pressure to a level just shy of aggressive. I set the manual override on my phone, not sure if I'd need it, but wanting the option. The mower stayed in the shed. This time, I'd be precise, surgical. Diane thought she could sneak back in. She was about to learn otherwise. Sunday dawned hot, a late spring heat wave turning the air thick and heavy. By 3, cars started parking, fewer than before, maybe 20 guests total, but just as oblivious. They dragged chairs across my grass, balancing trays of cupcakes and wine glasses. Diane wore a pale blue dress and a matching hat, waving at me like nothing had happened. I didn't wave back. I stood behind my living room blinds, watching, waiting. She set up a small wooden arch under the maple tree, no tent this time, but a battery-powered speaker hid under a tablecloth, its cord snaking through my grass. At exactly 4, Diane took her place beside her husband, a man who looked like he'd rather be golfing, and started speaking into a cheap microphone. Her voice droned about love, second chances, and cherished moments. I pressed the sprinkler button on my phone. Water erupted with a satisfying hiss, hitting the arch and splashing the front row of chairs. Diane yelped, her hat flying off. A guest screamed, clutching her purse like a shield. The speaker sparked and died, the microphone letting out a final whine. Guests scrambled, slipping on wet grass, dodging arcs of water. A man tried to save a soggy cake, only to trip and send it splattering against a chair. Diane turned toward my house, drenched, her mouth open in shock. I stepped onto the porch, lemonade in hand, leaning against the post like I was admiring a fountain. I didn't say a word. Her face said it all: disbelief, fury, defeat. The guests fled, and the lawn was cleared in under 10 minutes. Diane's husband shrugged, muttering something about heading home. She grabbed her soggy hat and left, the arch abandoned under the tree. I walked the yard after, picking up stray napkins and a gift bag with a seashell candle and a card that read, "May your love always bloom." I set it on the porch with the other relics from her first disaster. By nightfall, the lawn was clean, the sprinklers off, the hose coiled. I adjusted the security cameras, just in case. The next HOA meeting was 2 days later. I brought the vow renewal flyer, photos of the unauthorized setup, and a guest list someone had left behind. The board didn't argue. They'd seen the footage. Susan had caught this one too, though it hadn't gone viral yet. I requested a formal amendment to the bylaws, no repeated unauthorized events on private property, period. It passed without a single objection. Diane didn't attend. Word was she'd extended her stay at her sister's, maybe for good. The weeks following Diane's second failed attempt at commandeering my backyard brought a rare calm to Maple Grove. The neighborhood settled back into its familiar rhythm: kids riding bikes, dogs barking at squirrels, the hum of sprinklers in the early morning. My lawn, though still bearing faint scars from the wedding and vow renewal debacles, was healing. New grass sprouted, the azaleas perked up, and the maple tree stood as proud as ever, its leaves rustling in the breeze. For the first time in what felt like forever, my yard was just that mine. I spent my mornings tending to the damage, reseeding patches, and rebuilding the flower beds Diane's crew had trampled. Each shovelful of soil felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of what had been violated. The neighbors noticed. Jim stopped by with a 6-pack of root beer, joking that my lawn was starting to look like a golf course again. Susan, ever the storyteller, dropped off a printed screenshot of Diane's soggy vow renewal, captioned "Round 2, Sprinkler Edition." We laughed, but there was a quiet understanding among us. We'd drawn a line, and Diane had crossed it twice. There wouldn't be a third. The internet, however, wasn't done with her. The wedding video, now at 500,000 views, had spawned a subculture of memes, remixes, and even a parody song called 30 Minutes or Bust. The vow renewal clip, while less viral, was gaining traction, especially after someone edited it with cartoon sound effects, boings, and splashes every time the sprinklers hit. Diane's face, drenched and furious, was plastered on everything from coffee mugs to phone cases. A local radio station even mentioned the Maple Grove Mower Massacre in a segment about neighborhood feuds, though they got half the details wrong. Diane stayed away, her house dark except for the occasional flicker of a TV. Her husband, whom I'd barely seen during the chaos, mowed their lawn one afternoon, giving me a sheepish nod as he pushed the machine. I nodded back, figuring he was as tired of her schemes as the rest of us. Rumors swirled she was planning to sell the house, she was suing the HOA, she was writing a tell-all blog about toxic neighbors. I didn't care. My focus was on my yard, my peace, and the community that had rallied around me. The HOA board, chastened by the whole ordeal, got to work tightening the rules. The new bylaw: no unauthorized events on private property was just the start. They added clauses about guest limits, noise levels, and mandatory permits for any gathering over 10 people. At the next meeting, Carl, the retiree who'd proposed the first change, suggested a community fund to help repair property damage from HOA violations. It was a subtle jab at Diane's destruction of my lawn, and the room chuckled as it passed. I didn't say much, just thanked everyone for their support. The applause that followed caught me off guard, warm and genuine. Susan, never one to let a good story die, organized a block party to celebrate the return of peace. It was held in the community park, not anyone's backyard, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jim brought his leaf blower as a joke, revving it once to cheers and laughter. Tom, the HOA president, showed up with a tray of brownies and an apology for not stepping in sooner. I accepted both, though I still planned to invoice Diane for that borrowed chair. The party was simple: burgers, music, kids running through sprinklers, and it felt like the neighborhood was exhaling after holding its breath. But Diane had one last card to play. 2 weeks after the vow renewal, a certified letter arrived, this time from a different lawyer. It accused me of intentional infliction of emotional distress and demanded $10,000 in damages, plus a public apology at the next HOA meeting. The letter was longer than the first, filled with legal jargon and dramatic claims about Diane's humiliation and irreparable harm. It even mentioned the viral videos, blaming me for their spread, though I hadn't posted a single frame. I read it over dinner, chuckling at the absurdity. Diane's actions ignoring my warnings, breaking HOA rules, advertising my yard as her venue were the real culprits. I called Susan, who'd taken a paralegal course years ago, and she agreed to help me draft a response. We included the same evidence as before: photos, texts, the flyer, and a detailed timeline. We also pointed out that the videos were posted by third parties, not me, and that my actions mowing my lawn, running my sprinklers were perfectly legal. For good measure, I attached a $2,500 estimate for lawn repairs and suggested Diane's lawyer review the HOA guidelines she'd so helpfully provided. I mailed it, expecting silence, and that's what I got. The lawyer didn't reply, and Diane's house stayed quiet. The neighborhood, however, was anything but. The block party had sparked a new sense of camaraderie. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before now swapped stories over fences or shared beers on porches. Jim started a Lawn Legends group chat where we traded tips on grass care and the occasional Diane meme. Susan printed a mock certificate naming me Guardian of the Green, which I hung in my garage next to the mower. By midsummer, Diane's house went up for sale. A for sale sign appeared overnight, and a realtor hosted an open house the following weekend. I didn't go, but Susan did, reporting back that the place was staged to look like Diane had never lived. The Reno floral scarves, no clipboards, no trace of her chaos. The realtor, unaware of the backstory, mentioned the sellers were relocating for a fresh start. I wished them luck, wherever they landed. The house sold quickly, bought by a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. They introduced themselves one evening, asking for advice on maintaining the lawn. I gave them a quick rundown and invited them to the next block party. They seemed nice, the kind of neighbors who'd respect boundaries. Maple Grove was moving on. As for me, I found a new rhythm. Mornings were for coffee and gardening, evenings for sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the maple tree gold. The mower and leaf blower stayed in the shed, their work done for now. The sprinklers ran on a timer, no manual overrides needed. My yard was whole again, a testament to what I'd fought for: not just grass, but the right to call something mine. The videos eventually faded from the internet spotlight, replaced by the next viral moment. But in Maple Grove, the story lived on, told and retold at barbecues and HOA meetings. It wasn't just about a wedding gone wrong. It was about standing up, drawing a line, and holding it. Diane had underestimated me, and in doing so, she'd given the neighborhood a story to rally around. One evening, as I sat with Jim and Susan, sipping lemonade under the stars, Susan pulled out her phone and showed us a new meme. My mower photoshopped into a superhero's cape, captioned "The Lawn Avenger." We laughed until our sides hurt, the sound carrying across the cul-de-sac. The peace we'd fought for was real, hard-won, and ours. In the end, Diane's legacy wasn't her weddings or her clipboards, it was the lesson she left behind. Some people learn the easy way, some the hard way, and some, like Diane, only understand after being soaked twice and ignored completely. My yard was mine again, and this time, it stayed that way. Thank you for diving into the saga of the Maple Grove mower mayhem. This story is about more than a lawn. It's about standing up to injustice, protecting what's yours, and finding community in the fight. But it also raises questions about how far we should go to right or wrong. Was Mark's response a justified defense of his property, or did he cross into vindictive territory? What does this say about confronting unfairness in our own lives, whether it's a pushy neighbor or a bigger battle? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your take on Mark's actions, Diane's entitlement, or the role of community in resolving conflicts. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to draw a line? How did you handle it? Let's spark a conversation about justice, boundaries, and the messy, human ways we navigate them. Your perspective could inspire someone else, so don't hold back.